She walked into the dealership to buy a luxury car, but instead of respect, Lucille O'Neal got mocking whispers and dismissive stares. The staff laughed, the customers judged, until her son arrived. A towering figure, a legend, a millionaire. And with just a few words, everything changed. But by then, it was too late. The whole world was already watching. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun shone brightly over Atlanta as Lucille O'Neal stepped out of a sleek black SUV, her posture upright, exuding quiet confidence. Dressed in an elegant yet modest outfit, she adjusted her sunglasses and took a deep breath before walking toward the grand entrance of Hamilton Luxury Motors. The dealership was known for catering to the city's elite, a place where celebrities and business tycoons spent extravagantly. Yet, the moment she stepped inside, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. A few customers lounging near the waiting area paused their conversations, their gazes lingering a little longer than necessary. The receptionist, a young woman with a forced smile, hesitated before offering a half-hearted greeting. Behind her, a sharply dressed salesman named Derek Langston leaned against the reception desk, sizing up Lucille in an instant. To him, she was just another older woman, probably lost or fantasizing about a lifestyle she couldn't afford. Lucille paid no mind to the judgment in their eyes. She had come for a purpose. With steady steps, she walked past the gleaming rows of Bentleys, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis, her eyes scanning the showroom until she found what she was looking for. A stunning black Rolls-Royce Phantom parked under the chandelier lights, its sleek exterior reflecting the opulence of the dealership. Just as she was about to get a closer look, Derek pushed himself off the desk and approached with a polished yet condescending demeanor. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, forcing a smile, "that particular model is reserved for serious buyers." Lucille turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Good thing I'm serious about buying it then," she replied. A brief silence followed. Derek's polite mask slipped for a fraction of a second before he regained composure. He had encountered window shoppers before, people who came in just to admire the cars they could never afford. He wasn't about to waste his time. "Of course," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "It's a beautiful choice. But before we go any further, I should mention that this model starts at around $500,000. Fully loaded, of course." Lucille didn't flinch. "I know." A short chuckle escaped from a couple seated nearby. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit leaned toward his wife and whispered something, making her smirk. Another customer, a young influencer type, discreetly lifted her phone, tilting it just enough to record the scene. Derek cleared his throat, still not convinced. "Well, we do offer financing options if—" Lucille cut him off with a raised hand. "I won't need financing." For the first time, Derek seemed slightly taken aback. But old habits died hard, and he quickly masked his reaction. "I see. Would you like to look at some pre-owned models as well? We have excellent choices at a lower price range." Lucille's patience thinned. She locked eyes with him, her voice calm but firm. "I came for this car. Now, are you going to show me the details, or should I find a dealership that takes its customers seriously?" Derek hesitated, his pride wrestling with his instincts. Before he could answer, another salesman, Oliver Banks, walked up, sensing the tension. Oliver, though younger, was sharper. He had recognized Lucille O'Neal immediately. Unlike Derek, he knew exactly who she was, the mother of one of the most successful and beloved basketball legends of all time. His eyes darted to Derek, who was still looking at Lucille like she didn't belong. A mistake. A huge mistake. "Derek," Oliver said smoothly, "I'll take it from here." Derek frowned, confused by Oliver's sudden interference. "I've got it handled." Oliver ignored him and turned to Lucille with genuine warmth. "Ms. O'Neal, it's a pleasure to have you here. The Rolls-Royce Phantom is an excellent choice." Lucille gave him a knowing smile, appreciating the change in tone. "Thank you, young man. I'd love to take a closer look." Derek's confusion deepened, and his patience cracked. "Wait a minute," he scoffed. "You actually think she's buying this car?" The words hung in the air, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The murmurs grew louder. The woman recording the scene zoomed in, capturing every second. Oliver's jaw tightened. "Derek, step back." Lucille arched an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Did I ask for a test drive?" Derek faltered. "I said I wanted to buy it. Now, if this dealership has a policy against selling luxury cars to people like me, just say it outright. Otherwise, run my information and let's move forward." The entire showroom fell silent. Even the businessman who had laughed earlier suddenly looked uncomfortable. The woman filming whispered, "Oh, this is going viral." Derek's face turned red. He had backed himself into a corner, and there was no easy way out. But before he could respond, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" The energy shifted instantly. Heads turned toward the entrance as a towering figure stepped inside. The man was impossible to miss, Shaquille O'Neal, larger than life, dressed casually but exuding effortless authority. His presence was electrifying. The moment people realized who he was, whispers erupted like wildfire. Derek's face drained of color. Lucille turned slightly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Oh, hey son. I was just about to buy a car, but apparently, that's a problem for some people." Shaq's expression remained unreadable as he glanced between his mother and Derek. He took one slow step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. Derek swallowed hard. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize..." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Didn't realize what?" His voice was low, but there was an undeniable edge to it. The air in the showroom was thick with tension. No one dared to move. Lucille, ever composed, sighed and shook her head. "Never mind that now. Can we just buy the car and leave?" Shaq's gaze didn't leave Derek's. He held it just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle before finally nodding. "Yeah, let's get this done." Oliver, trying to salvage the situation, cleared his throat. "Of course, Mr. O'Neal. Right this way." As Lucille and Shaq followed Oliver toward the office, Derek stood frozen, the reality of his mistake sinking in. The woman recording the scene? She didn't stop. The video would soon find its way online, but Derek didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he had just insulted the wrong person. The air inside Hamilton Luxury Motors grew heavier, thick with tension, as Lucille O'Neal stood calmly in front of the dealership staff. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom gleamed under the showroom lights, an undeniable statement of power and prestige. Yet, despite her unwavering composure, the skepticism around her presence in this dealership was growing louder, more obvious. Derek Langston, the salesman who had already made his assumptions about her, forced another tight-lipped smile. His posture stiffened, his impatience barely concealed as he glanced around at the other customers. Some were watching with smug amusement, while others simply waited for the scene to unfold. "Ma'am," Derek said, his voice taking on a condescending edge. "These kinds of vehicles require serious commitment, and, well, we typically cater to a very exclusive clientele." Lucille held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said simply. A couple standing near a sleek Aston Martin chuckled, their laughter low but deliberate. The man, a well-dressed businessman with salt and pepper hair, leaned toward his equally polished wife, speaking just loud enough for Lucille to hear. "Some people just don't understand their limits," he muttered. His wife smirked, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Lucille remained still, letting the moment settle. She had encountered this kind of treatment before, disguised condescension, quiet exclusion, polite hostility. She had been raised to handle such situations with grace, but that didn't mean she had to tolerate it. Derek exhaled sharply, tapping a pen against his clipboard. "Let's not waste each other's time. Why don't I show you something more realistic?" The final word was drenched in quiet disrespect. Lucille's fingers twitched slightly, but her voice remained controlled. "I don't recall asking for a discount version of what I want," she replied. "I said I'm buying the Phantom. I'd like to move forward with the paperwork." Derek hesitated, his mind working through the situation. It wasn't just that he doubted she could afford it, he didn't want to believe it. He had been in this business long enough to know the kind of clientele that usually walked through those doors. And in his world, Lucille O'Neal didn't fit the profile. "Okay," he said, forcing a laugh. "So how exactly will you be paying?" Lucille tilted her head slightly. "You're welcome to run my credit check." The businessman and his wife exchanged amused glances. The wife, still toying with her bracelet, chimed in. "Sweetheart, I think what he means is, do you have the kind of numbers they'll be looking for?" Lucille turned her head slightly in their direction. There was no anger in her expression, just the quiet steel of a woman who had nothing to prove. Derek hesitated again, shifting uncomfortably. He had been expecting an excuse, a flustered reaction, something to confirm his assumption that she was wasting his time. But Lucille O'Neal stood there, calm and composed, waiting. Then, he made his final mistake. "With all due respect, we don't usually run credit checks for customers unless we're confident it'll be worth the effort," he said. His voice was laced with false politeness, but the meaning was crystal clear. The murmurs around them grew louder. Someone at the far end of the showroom let out a low whistle, as if impressed by his audacity. The influencer who had been recording earlier subtly adjusted her phone, making sure to catch every second of the unfolding scene. Lucille let a small breath escape, shaking her head slightly. Then, before she could respond, another voice cut through the air. "That's not how this works." The room shifted as a young woman stepped forward. She had been standing near the entrance, watching the scene unfold with increasing disbelief. Now she moved toward Lucille, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Derek. "Excuse me?" Derek asked, clearly irritated. "You don't get to pick and choose who gets taken seriously," the woman said, her voice even but firm. She turned to Lucille, offering a polite nod. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. "I used to work at a dealership like this one," she said, handing the card to Lucille. "Same tactics, same bias. You're not the first person they've treated this way." Lucille took the card, glancing at the name printed in bold black letters. Avery Carter, attorney at law. Derek stiffened. "Look, I don't know what you're implying." "Oh, I think you do," Avery cut in. "Let me guess. You didn't ask for proof of funds from any of your other customers today. Just this one?" Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. The businessman who had mocked Lucille earlier suddenly shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing the situation had taken a turn he hadn't expected. His wife's smirk had disappeared entirely. Lucille, who had been silent during the exchange, looked at Avery with quiet curiosity. "You didn't have to step in," she said. Avery gave her a small, knowing smile. "Yeah. Well, I have a bad habit of not letting things slide." Lucille glanced back at Derek, then at the silent dealership staff who had suddenly found great interest in their computer screens. She turned the business card over in her fingers, then looked back at Avery. "You worked in a dealership before?" she asked. Avery nodded. "Long enough to see how they treat certain customers, and long enough to know how they scramble when they realize they messed with the wrong one." Lucille exhaled a small laugh. She liked this girl. Derek, realizing how quickly the situation had spiraled, forced himself to regain control. He straightened his shoulders and gestured toward the receptionist's desk. "If you'd still like to move forward," he said stiffly, "I suppose we can run your information." Lucille didn't move. She tapped the business card against her palm for a moment, then tucked it into her purse. "You know what?" she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I think I'll wait." Derek frowned. "Wait for what?" Lucille's gaze didn't waver. "For my son." A sudden hush fell over the showroom. The words, so simple, yet so weighty, hung in the air like an approaching storm. Derek's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "Your son?" Lucille checked her watch. "He'll be here soon. Let's see if he has a different experience than I did." A nervous laugh bubbled from Derek's lips, but it lacked confidence. He glanced at the other staff members, as if searching for guidance, but no one met his eyes. The businessman who had mocked Lucille earlier suddenly seemed very, very interested in his watch. Avery smirked. She had a feeling she knew exactly who Lucille's son was. Lucille exhaled and turned back toward the Rolls-Royce, trailing her fingers along the sleek black hood. This wasn't over. And Derek Langston was about to learn that the hard way. Lucille O'Neal sat in one of the leather chairs in the dealership's waiting area, her posture relaxed, but her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The room still carried the uncomfortable energy of what had just transpired, with Derek Langston pacing slightly near the receptionist's desk, throwing uneasy glances in her direction. The businessman and his wife who had mocked her earlier had gone suspiciously quiet, their previous smirks now replaced with an unmistakable tension. She took her phone out of her purse, her expression unreadable, and with a few swift taps she sent a short message. "Lucille, I need you to come by the dealership." There was no follow-up, no explanation. She knew she didn't need one. Less than 10 minutes later, the rhythmic hum of a high-performance engine rumbled from the street outside. The showroom's tall glass windows framed the sight of a massive black SUV rolling to a smooth stop right in front of the entrance. Inside, the dealership staff and lingering customers instinctively turned toward the doors, their curiosity piqued. Derek's hand momentarily tightened around the pen he'd been holding, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. The rich businessman shifted uncomfortably, suddenly more interested in his watch. Even Avery, the young woman who had come to Lucille's defense earlier, leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in the air. Then, the car door opened. A towering figure stepped out, his movements smooth yet commanding, and as soon as his 6'11" frame emerged fully from the vehicle, a collective hush swept through the room. Shaquille O'Neal had arrived. The sheer presence of the man was enough to change the atmosphere in an instant. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was an icon, a basketball legend, a businessman, a cultural giant, and most importantly, the devoted son of the woman who had just been disrespected in this very dealership. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A few customers pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages while discreetly recording the moment. The receptionist sat up straighter, suddenly hyper-aware of how different the situation had become. Shaq stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with calm, measured intensity. He wasn't in a hurry. He never needed to be. His presence alone was enough to demand attention. Lucille didn't move from her seat, but a small, knowing smile played at her lips as she met her son's gaze. Shaq walked forward, his footsteps measured, and came to a stop directly in front of Derek. The salesman, now looking visibly rattled, forced a polite smile that looked more like a grimace. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his deep voice smooth but firm as he spoke. "Is there a problem?" Derek's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He suddenly looked smaller than he had 5 minutes ago. No, sir, of course not," Derek stammered, his confidence unraveling with every second. "We were just discussing some details with your mother." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Discussing?" His voice remained calm, but there was a weight behind the word, a quiet challenge that made Derek shift uncomfortably. Lucille finally stood, smoothing out her jacket as she took a few steps closer. She placed a hand on Shaq's arm, a silent reassurance, before looking back at Derek. "This gentleman," she said evenly, "was hesitant to process my purchase. Apparently, he wasn't sure if I was worth the effort." Shaq's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a quiet but unmistakable sign that he was not pleased. Derek, realizing how bad this looked, let out an awkward chuckle. Now, I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding." Shaq didn't let him finish. He turned to Oliver, the younger salesman who had recognized Lucille earlier and had attempted to intervene. "You work here too?" Shaq asked. Oliver nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Shaq motioned toward Derek without looking at him. "Is this how y'all do business?" Oliver hesitated, clearly not wanting to throw his coworker under the bus, but he also knew that Shaquille O'Neal was not someone you lied to. Oliver glanced at Derek, then at Lucille. Finally, he exhaled and answered, "No, sir. It's not how we should do business." Derek shot Oliver a glare, but it was pointless. The damage was already done. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Then he turned back to his mother, his voice softer when he spoke to her. "Ma, you still want the car?" Lucille smiled, a small glint of amusement in her eyes. "Of course I do." Shaq nodded, then looked back at Derek. "Then I suggest you go ahead and finalize it. Or would you like me to buy the whole dealership first?" A collective inhale filled the room. The businessman who had insulted Lucille earlier blanched, his face going pale as if realizing just how much power the O'Neal name carried. Derek, now looking as if he wanted to sink into the floor, quickly nodded. "Right away, Mr. O'Neal. Absolutely." He turned and nearly tripped over himself as he hurried toward the office to get the paperwork. Lucille shook her head, watching him scramble. She then turned to Shaq, tilting her head slightly. "You didn't have to do all that." Shaq smirked. "Yeah, I did." Avery, who had been watching everything unfold, couldn't hold back her laughter anymore. She folded her arms across her chest, shaking her head. That was satisfying to watch. Shaq glanced at her, his expression curious. "You the one who stood up for my mom earlier?" Avery nodded. "Sure am." Shaq studied her for a moment, then gave her an approving nod. "I like you." Avery grinned. "Good to know." The tension in the room had completely shifted. The fear, the discomfort, the ugly undercurrent of classism and racism that had lingered just moments before. All of it had been silenced by Shaquille O'Neal's presence. Lucille exhaled, looking around the dealership one last time. Then, she looped her arm through her son's, graceful as ever, and walked toward the sales office. As she passed by the businessman and his wife, she paused just long enough to say, "Have a nice day." And with that, she disappeared into the office, ready to sign the papers for her brand new Rolls-Royce. The mood inside Hamilton Luxury Motors had shifted dramatically, but not in a way that brought comfort. The moment Shaquille O'Neal had walked in, the once dismissive employees and customers had started treating Lucille O'Neal like royalty. Gone were the skeptical glances, the judgmental whispers. Instead, nervous smiles, forced politeness, and exaggerated courtesy filled the room. And Shaq? He noticed everything. As Derek rushed off to process the paperwork, the tension in the showroom was still thick, but now it was mixed with something else. Fear. The rich businessman who had ridiculed Lucille earlier was suddenly very interested in his phone, his wife clinging to his arm as if proximity could erase what had happened. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged Lucille upon her arrival, now stood rigid behind her desk, eyes darting between Shaq and the office. Then, as if on cue, the dealership owner burst through a side door. Howard Clifton III, a balding man in his late 50s with an expensive tailored suit and an air of forced confidence, stormed toward the center of the showroom. A practiced smile stretched across his face. He was the kind of man who prided himself on knowing all the right people, and judging by his panicked expression, he had just realized he had seriously miscalculated. "Mr. O'Neal," Howard exclaimed, extending a hand as he approached. "What an absolute pleasure. If I had known you were coming in, I would have been here personally to assist your mother." Shaq didn't shake his hand. He didn't even acknowledge it. Lucille, standing beside her son, simply raised an eyebrow. "Oh, now it's a pleasure?" Howard's smile faltered for half a second, but he recovered quickly. Of course. Mrs. O'Neal, I sincerely apologize if there was any miscommunication earlier." Avery, the young woman who had defended Lucille earlier, let out a quiet scoff from the side. "Miscommunication," she muttered. Shaq finally spoke, his deep voice measured but sharp. "There was no miscommunication. Your guys knew exactly what they were doing." Howard's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I can assure you, Mr. O'Neal, we at Hamilton Motors hold ourselves to the highest standards of customer service. If any of my employees made your mother feel anything less than welcome, I will personally ensure it never happens again." Lucille folded her arms. "Interesting. And what about all the other people you've treated like this before?" Howard's fake charm cracked for a split second, but he quickly forced another smile. "Now, Mrs. O'Neal, I don't think—" "Sir." A new voice cut through the conversation. Everyone turned to see a young dealership employee standing hesitantly near the service desk. He was no older than 25, with neatly combed brown hair and an uneasy expression. His name tag read Kyle. Howard's eyes immediately narrowed. "Kyle, this doesn't concern you." Kyle ignored him. His gaze flickered between Lucille and Shaq before he took a careful step forward. "Actually, it does," he said, his voice steady but clearly nervous. "Because what happened today, it's not the first time." Silence. Howard's face twisted into a forced chuckle. "Kyle, I don't know what you think." Kyle cut him off. "I've been working here for 2 years," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "And I've seen it happen over and over again. Customers who don't fit the image get ignored, questioned, or straight up turned away." His gaze turned to Lucille. You're just the first person with enough influence to call them out on it. Murmurs rippled through the showroom. A few other employees avoided eye contact, their guilty expressions confirming everything Kyle had just said. Howard's smile vanished completely. That's enough. Kyle hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Then, with one last glance at Shaq, he turned and walked toward the back, disappearing through a side door. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You really thought no one would notice, huh? Howard had no response. His fingers twitched at his sides, his power slipping away by the second. Lucille, watching it all unfold, suddenly felt a familiar flash of memory. A time when she and Shaq had experienced something similar, but had no platform, no voice, no power to change it. A small apartment in Newark, New Jersey. The heater rattled noisily against the winter cold as Lucille, much younger, counted crumpled bills on the tiny kitchen table. Shaquille, barely in his teens, sat across from her, watching silently as she carefully stacked the money into sections. Rent, groceries, bus fare. Not this month, she murmured to herself, shaking her head as she pushed aside an envelope labeled new shoes. Shaq, already growing taller than most kids his age, shifted in his seat. His sneakers, the ones he had outgrown weeks ago, pressed uncomfortably against his toes. But he didn't say anything. He never did. Lucille glanced up, catching his gaze. You'll get new ones soon, she promised. He nodded, trusting her. The next day, Lucille had walked into a department store, intent on buying Shaq a decent pair of sneakers, even if it meant stretching the budget. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The same kind of skepticism she felt today. The cashier, the security guard, the other shoppers, all watching her, all assuming she couldn't afford to be there. She had ignored them. She had bought the shoes. And she had never forgotten the feeling of being judged simply for existing in a space they didn't think she belonged in. Lucille blinked, the memory fading. But the feeling remained the same. Only this time, she wasn't walking out of the store in silence. Shaq looked at his mother, recognizing that distant look in her eyes. He knew exactly where her mind had gone. "Ma," he said softly. Lucille exhaled, her expression firm again. "I'm fine," she assured him. Then, turning back to Howard, she squared her shoulders. "You don't get to fix this with an apology." Howard, still floundering, tried to recover. "Mrs. O'Neal, I assure you, we value all our customers." Shaq held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I don't want to hear it," he said. "You don't respect people. You respect money. And today you learned that sometimes the people you dismiss are the ones with the most of it?" Howard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Shaq looked at Oliver, the young salesman who had treated Lucille properly from the beginning. You're the one who's getting the commission from this sale." Oliver's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yeah," Shaq said. "You're the only one here who acted like a decent human being." Howard looked furious, but couldn't do anything about it. Shaq put a hand on his mother's shoulder. "You ready, Ma?" Lucille nodded. More than ready. Together they turned and walked toward the office, leaving Howard Clifton III standing in the wreckage of his carefully crafted reputation. And just like that, the truth was out in the open, and there was no covering it up anymore. As Shaquille O'Neal and his mother, Lucille O'Neal, finalized the purchase of her brand new black Rolls-Royce Phantom, the air inside Hamilton Luxury Motors remained thick with tension. The employees who had once dismissed Lucille were now stiff with nervous energy, realizing that they had just made one of the biggest mistakes of their careers. But what none of them knew, not Derek, not Howard Clifton III, not the smug businessmen who had insulted Lucille earlier, was that the damage had already been done. And there was no undoing it, because someone had been recording the entire thing. Seated near the entrance, Jenna Rodriguez, a 22-year-old social media influencer, had been quietly capturing the entire confrontation from the moment Derek condescended to Lucille. At first, she had started recording out of curiosity, just another example of everyday discrimination, something she had seen too many times before. But the moment Shaq walked in, the stakes changed. Jenna knew she was witnessing something big. By the time Shaq called out the dealership's hypocrisy and sealed the deal in his mother's favor, Jenna had captured a full 12-minute video. And as soon as Shaq and Lucille stepped out of the dealership, she uploaded it to Twitter and Instagram. Caption: This luxury car dealership tried to humiliate Shaq's mom. Then Shaq walked in, and everything changed. Watch till the end. Your Big Shaq. Respect your elders. Just exposed. She hit post. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Online reactions. The internet erupts. The video spread like wildfire. By the time Shaq and Lucille had even driven away from the dealership, it had already been viewed over 100,000 times. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some were outraged. This is disgusting. They really tried to humiliate an elderly black woman for wanting to buy a car she could clearly afford. SMH. Others were shocked. The way their whole energy shifted when Shaq walked in? LMAO. These people are only nice when they think you have money. Basketball fans were hyped. Shaq didn't even raise his voice. Didn't need to. He just existed, and that was enough to make them panic. Celebrities joined in. Retweets and comments started pouring in from famous figures. LeBron James, Kevin Hart, Snoop Dogg, and even Oprah shared the video, each one calling out the dealership's blatant discrimination. Within an hour, the hashtag #Hamilton Motors Exposed started trending at #1 on Twitter. Inside the dealership, Howard Clifton III sat behind his massive desk, staring at his phone with horror. His social media notifications were blowing up, and not in a good way. "What the hell is happening?" he barked, looking up at Derek and the other employees. Derek, who was still shaken from his disastrous interaction with Shaq, shifted uncomfortably. I think someone filmed what happened earlier," he muttered. Howard clenched his jaw. "You think?" He turned to the receptionist. "How bad is it?" She hesitated, then slowly held up her phone, showing him the viral video with over 1 million views already. Howard's face drained of color. "Get our PR team on the phone. Now," he snapped. Minutes later, Hamilton Luxury Motors released a statement on Twitter. "We at Hamilton Luxury Motors deeply regret today's unfortunate incident involving a valued customer. We pride ourselves on inclusivity and exceptional service. We will be reviewing our policies to ensure that such misunderstandings never happen again." The response was immediate and brutal. Misunderstanding? Y'all literally laughed in this woman's face. Just say you got caught. This apology is trash. No accountability, just damage control. Imagine being racist and classist in the same breath. Y'all deserve every bit of this backlash. Despite their attempts to contain the fallout, the damage was done. Back at home, Shaq sat at his kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone as message after message flooded his notifications. His manager had called 3 times already. Reporters were asking for statements, and people all over the world were waiting for his response. But for now, he said nothing. He let the world react first. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about his mother, about respect, about how people like her were treated when no one famous was around to intervene. Lucille sat across from him, sipping her tea, her brand new Rolls-Royce parked outside. "They're panicking, aren't they?" she mused. Shaq smirked, shaking his head. "Oh yeah, big time." She exhaled, watching him carefully. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He could say something now. Call them out, expose them further. Or he could wait. Let them sweat. Finally, he set his phone down. Let's see how much worse they make it for themselves first. Lucille chuckled, knowing full well that when Shaq did finally speak, it would be game over for Hamilton Luxury Motors. The storm surrounding Hamilton Luxury Motors had only grown in the last 24 hours. The dealership's botched apology had backfired, leading to even more backlash. News outlets had picked up the viral footage, dissecting every moment of the humiliation Lucille O'Neal had endured, and calling out the blatant discrimination. Through it all, one detail stood out to Shaquille O'Neal, the young woman who had spoken up for his mother before anyone else had the courage to. She had risked putting herself in the spotlight, knowing full well that calling out injustice in public spaces often came with consequences. And that intrigued Shaq. So he decided to find her. Shaq sat in his home office, his phone in one hand, scrolling through the countless reposts of the video. Somebody's gotta know who she is, he muttered to himself. It didn't take long. A quick search of the hashtags attached to the viral video led him to a comment thread where people were trying to identify her. A few comments in, he spotted a username at AveryCarterlaw. He tapped the profile. Avery Carter, third-year law student, passionate about civil rights, social justice, and advocacy. Bingo. Shaq leaned back in his chair and smiled. All right, let's see what you're about. The next morning, Avery Carter was seated in the corner of a small coffee shop, flipping through her notes on workplace discrimination laws. Her laptop was open in front of her, half a dozen tabs filled with legal articles and case studies. She had been following the fallout from the Hamilton Motors debacle, but she hadn't expected her role in it to become so visible. Her phone buzzed, a new notification. She glanced at the screen, and her eyes widened. Shaquille O'Neal has followed you. She blinked. Then another notification popped up. Shaquille O'Neal sent you a DM. Avery took a breath before opening it. Shaq. Hey, Avery. Appreciate you standing up for my mom. Got time to talk? Avery stared at the message. Was this real? Before she could second-guess herself, she typed a response. Avery. Of course. When and where? The reply came within seconds. Shaq. I'm in town. Let's meet. An hour later, Avery found herself walking into a quiet, private lounge of an upscale restaurant, where Shaq was already waiting. He stood as she approached, offering a handshake. Avery, he said, his voice warm but serious. Good to finally meet you. Avery shook his hand. Same here. They sat down. A waiter came over, but Shaq waved him off. This wasn't a social visit. I wanted to thank you, Shaq said, getting straight to the point. Not a lot of people speak up in situations like that. Avery shrugged. Didn't think about it. Just did what felt right. Shaq studied her for a moment. That kind of confidence comes from experience, he said. This happened to you before? Avery exhaled, tapping her fingers lightly against her coffee cup. Yeah, she admitted. At that exact dealership, actually. Shaq leaned forward slightly. Tell me. Avery set her cup down. A year ago, I went to Hamilton Motors with my uncle. He's a real estate developer, well off, but he doesn't always dress like it. We were looking at a Mercedes SUV, and the second we walked in, I could tell they weren't taking us seriously. The salesman kept pushing us toward the used lot, making comments like, "These are more affordable options." We hadn't even said what our budget was. My uncle let it slide at first, but then when he asked about the financing options on the Mercedes, the guy straight up laughed and said, "People like you usually don't go for cars like this." Shaq clenched his jaw. People like you. Avery nodded. Yeah. My uncle didn't say a word after that. He just turned and walked out. And the worst part? She let out a humorless laugh. We went down the street to another dealership and bought the same exact SUV. No questions, no judgment, just business. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. So, when you saw my mom getting the same treatment, I knew exactly what was happening, Avery finished. Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then Shaq asked, That wasn't the first time you dealt with this, was it? Avery hesitated. Then she shook her head. Number, it wasn't. She took a deep breath before speaking again. My dad was an executive at a major financial firm, one of the best in his department, but he got passed up for a promotion, twice, because in their words, he didn't fit the image of senior leadership. Shaq frowned. They really said that? Avery nodded. Not directly, but they made it clear. And when he pushed back, they started cutting his responsibilities, making his job harder. Eventually, they pushed him out. A guy with half his experience took his place. Shaq exhaled slowly. And that's why you're studying law. Avery nodded. I don't just want to talk about change. I want to make it happen. Shaq sat back, tapping a finger on the table. He'd met a lot of people in his life. People who talked big about justice and fairness, but never actually did anything about it. But Avery? She was different. I respect that. he said finally. A lot. Avery smiled. I appreciate that. Then Shaq's expression shifted slightly, something sharp and calculating entering his eyes. You ever thought about getting real experience? Not just in a classroom? Avery frowned. What do you mean? Shaq leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I mean, you're clearly smart. You've seen discrimination firsthand. And now, you're in the middle of a story that's got the whole country talking. Avery's brow furrowed. Yeah? So, Shaq said, what if we use that? Avery sat up straighter. I'm listening. Shaq smirked. Hamilton Motors? They're scrambling right now. They know they messed up. But an apology tweet and fake damage control won't fix this. Avery's lips curled into a knowing smile. No, it won't. Shaq pointed at her. You're a law student. You know about accountability. How about we make sure this doesn't happen again? Avery's mind was already racing. You mean, legally? Not just legally, Shaq said. Publicly, we expose everything. Policies, numbers, hiring biases, not just at this dealership, but everywhere. Make it bigger than just my mom's story. Avery stared at him, her heart pounding with excitement. That's a serious move. Shaq grinned. I don't do small moves. Avery laughed. You really don't. She reached across the table, offering her hand. All right, let's do it. Shaq shook her hand, sealing the deal. This wasn't just about one dealership anymore. This was about change. And they were just getting started. The media storm surrounding Hamilton Luxury Motors showed no signs of slowing down. What had started as a single viral video had now exploded into a nationwide discussion about discrimination in high-end businesses. News anchors debated it, podcasts dissected it, and social media continued to drag the dealership for its blatant bias. Still, through it all, Shaquille O'Neal had remained silent. People were waiting, begging for him to speak. Every major talk show wanted an exclusive interview. Reporters camped outside his house. Even some of his celebrity friends had called, urging him to respond. But Shaq didn't rush. Because while the world was focused on the scandal, he was already making his next move. When Shaq finally spoke, he did it on his terms. No PR spin, no scripted apology. Just a raw, unfiltered conversation with a respected journalist, Malcolm Tate, on a primetime segment of the Tate Report. The interview took place in a quiet, intimate studio, just Shaq and Malcolm seated across from each other. The world was watching. Malcolm leaned forward. Shaq, you've been silent for days. People want to know. Why now? Shaq exhaled, resting his hands on the table. Because I wanted to see what they'd do first, he said. I wanted to see if Hamilton Motors would actually take responsibility, or if they'd just try to cover their tracks. Malcolm nodded. And what do you think now? Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. Man, they played themselves. The audience watching from home hung on to every word. They thought this would blow over, Shaq continued. They thought a half-baked apology would be enough. But here's the thing. This isn't just about my mom. This is about every person who's ever been treated like they don't belong because of how they look. Malcolm's expression grew serious. You think this kind of discrimination is common in high-end businesses? Shaq gave him a knowing look. You think? Go ask any Black, Latino, or immigrant family who's walked into a luxury store, a five-star hotel, or a dealership like that. Ask how many times they've been followed, ignored, or asked if they can afford it. Malcolm let the silence settle before asking, So what happens now? Shaq leaned forward slightly. Now. We will do something about it. Shaq's words ignited a firestorm. The interview was shared millions of times within hours. Celebrities, activists, and business leaders joined the conversation, calling out the deep-rooted discrimination in luxury spaces. Luxury brands suddenly felt the pressure, scrambling to issue statements about inclusivity and fairness. Some high-end businesses even started posting diversity pledges, hoping to avoid their own PR disaster. But for Hamilton Luxury Motors, it was already too late. The backlash hit hard. Customers began canceling their orders. Wealthy clients who didn't want to be associated with the controversy pulled their business elsewhere. Protests formed outside the dealership. People showed up in droves, holding signs that read, Respect is a luxury everyone can afford, and racism doesn't belong in business. The dealership's Yelp and Google reviews tanked. Every hour, more people flooded their page, leaving one-star reviews and calling out their racist behavior. Howard Clifton III, the dealership's owner, tried to salvage what was left. He went on a radio show, desperately claiming, "This was all a big misunderstanding. We love all our customers." No one bought it. Then, in a final act of desperation, Hamilton Motors listed itself for sale. And that's when Shaq made his move. What the world didn't know was that, while everyone was focused on the scandal, Shaq had been working behind the scenes. Through a private shell company, he quietly acquired Hamilton Luxury Motors for a fraction of its worth. No press, no announcements, total silence, until the day of the reveal. A week after Shaq's interview, news reporters gathered outside Hamilton Motors, sensing that something big was about to happen. Employees stood nervously inside, whispering to each other, confused about the sudden closed-door meeting they had been summoned to. Then, Shaquille O'Neal walked in. Howard Clifton III, who had been waiting with a forced, hopeful smile, froze in place when he saw Shaq approach. "Shaq," he said, his voice cracking. What brings you back?" Shaq pulled out a crisp set of documents from his coat pocket and placed them on the desk. Howard picked them up, his hands trembling as he skimmed the pages. His face went ghost white. These weren't just legal documents. They were ownership papers. Shaquille O'Neal now owned Hamilton Luxury Motors. Howard stumbled over his words. This is a mistake. You..." Shaq cut him off with a calm smile. "Nah, no mistake. I bought you out." Howard's knees nearly buckled. "You can't..." "I did," Shaq said simply. "And first order of business?" His smile disappeared. "You're fired." The entire room fell silent. Howard's lips parted in shock, but no words came out. Shaq turned to Derek Langston, the salesman who had humiliated Lucille. "You too." Derek visibly paled. "Shaq, come on, man." "You should have treated my mom with respect the first time," Shaq said. "You don't get a second chance." And just like that, the men who had once controlled Hamilton Motors were escorted out of their own building. Once they were gone, Shaq addressed the remaining employees. "Some of y'all did the right thing," he said, looking at Oliver, the salesman who had treated Lucille with kindness. "And some of y'all didn't, but I don't believe in running a business built on discrimination." He turned, gesturing toward the entrance. Avery Carter walked in. "This is Avery," Shaq announced. She stood up when no one else did, and from now on, she's running this place. The employees stared in shock as Avery took her place beside Shaq. The woman who had once been ignored in this dealership was now its manager. She glanced around, soaking in the moment, before turning to Shaq. "Let's make sure this place actually represents what luxury is supposed to mean," she said. Shaq grinned. "That's the plan." And just like that, Hamilton Motors was reborn. Not as a place of exclusion and arrogance, but as a business that stood for fairness, dignity, and respect for all. Howard Clifton III sat in his dimly lit office, the air thick with tension. Papers were scattered across his desk, legal documents, financial reports, a resignation letter he hadn't signed yet. His once pristine empire had crumbled overnight, and there was nothing he could do about it. The news had spread like wildfire. Hamilton Luxury Motors had a new owner, Shaquille O'Neal. The very man he had tried to belittle had taken everything from him, and now he was left with nothing but his pride and a tarnished reputation. But Howard wasn't ready to give up. He reached for his phone and dialed Shaq's number. Shaq was in his new office at Hamilton Motors when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, saw Howard's name, and let it ring twice before answering. "You got a lot of nerve calling me," Shaq said, leaning back in his chair. Howard exhaled shakily. "Shaq, listen. I made mistakes. But you and I both know how business works. Sometimes people say things they don't mean. It's not personal. It was personal," Shaq cut in, his voice calm but firm. Howard hesitated. He had no excuse for what had happened, and he knew it. but he wasn't here to argue. He was here to beg for mercy. "I need a way out of this," Howard admitted. "A second chance. You're a businessman, you understand that, right? Everyone's dragging my name through the mud. My family's getting hate mail. My kids—" Shaq's jaw clenched. He had no sympathy for the consequences of Howard's own actions, but he wasn't the type to be unnecessarily cruel. "So what do you want?" Shaq asked. Howard hesitated, then sighed. "A public statement. If you tell people I wasn't as bad as they think, maybe—" Shaq let out a short laugh. "You think I'm about to lie for you?" Howard scrambled. "Not a lie, just a little damage control. You don't have to forgive me, but if you say something, the public will listen. Maybe they'll move on." Shaq was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "You want a second chance?" Howard nodded vigorously. "Yes. Just tell me what I have to do." Shaq exhaled. "All right. You got one option." Howard perked up. "Anything." "You get in front of a camera," Shaq said. "You admit what you did. You own it. No excuses, no blaming misunderstandings. You say exactly what happened and apologize. For real. Not some PR-crafted nonsense. A real apology." Howard's face paled. "On camera?" Shaq nodded. "National television. No edits, no script." Howard froze, his mind racing. A public confession would mean permanent damage to his name, his future, his ability to rebuild anything in the business world. He had spent years crafting his image, and now Shaq wanted him to burn it all down himself. "No," Howard said, shaking his head. "I can't do that." Shaq shrugged. "Then we're done here." Howard panicked. "Wait!" Shaq hung up. Howard had hoped that if he refused Shaq's offer, the controversy would eventually die down. But what happened next sealed his fate forever. A former employee of Hamilton Motors, a man named Raymond Holt, had been watching the news unfold. He had worked at the dealership for 6 years before quitting, frustrated by the quiet, unspoken discrimination he had witnessed behind closed doors. And now, he was done being silent. Raymond reached out to Avery Carter, the young law student Shaq had recently appointed as manager. "I have something you need to see," he told her. That afternoon, they met at a small cafe, where Raymond placed a USB drive on the table between them. "What's on it?" Avery asked. Raymond's face was grim. "Proof." Avery plugged the USB into her laptop that evening, sitting in Shaq's office while he looked over financial reports. The second she opened the first file, her stomach dropped. Security footage, old emails, complaints from customers and employees. All of it exposing a long history of discrimination at Hamilton Motors. There were emails from Derek Langston, making crude jokes about black customers not belonging. There was footage of Howard himself, shaking hands with customers who looked a certain way while ignoring others. There were internal reports of complaints from employees who had tried to speak up and had been ignored. Avery looked up at Shaq, her expression hard. "We can take this public." Shaq's eyes darkened as he scrolled through the files. He nodded slowly. "We will." As the news about the leaked files spread, something unexpected happened. Avery's father's wrongful termination case was reopened. Avery's father, James Carter, had been fired from a major financial firm years ago under suspicious circumstances. They had claimed company restructuring, but Avery had always believed it was because he had spoken out against bias in hiring promotions. With the public eye now focused on workplace discrimination, James Carter's story resurfaced. Avery sat across from her father at their kitchen table, holding the legal documents in her hands. "They want to reopen the case," she told him. "We could win this." James sighed, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know, Avery. It's been years. I just wanted to move on." Avery reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Dad, this isn't just about you anymore. You always told me to fight for what's right." James met his daughter's determined gaze. He exhaled deeply, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." Through all of this, Lucille O'Neal remained calm and composed, just as she always had. When a news reporter stopped her outside her home, asking if she had any final words for the dealership, she simply smiled and said, "I've always believed in treating people with kindness, even when they don't deserve it." But kindness doesn't mean letting people get away with wrongdoing. My son stood up for me, and now I stand up for everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong. Her words struck a chord with the public. People admired her grace, her patience, and her quiet power. She wasn't out for revenge, she was out for justice. In the days that followed, something incredible happened. More people started coming forward. Stories flooded the internet. Customers sharing their own experiences of being profiled at luxury stores, dealerships, and high-end businesses. Employees from different industries spoke up about bias in hiring, promotions, and corporate culture. What had started as one incident in a dealership had turned into a national conversation. And at the center of it all? Shaquille O'Neal, Lucille O'Neal, and Avery Carter. With the leaked files, the backlash, and the failed attempt at damage control, Howard Clifton III's career was over. Investors pulled their money from his remaining businesses, and he was forced to sell off assets just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, Hamilton Motors thrived under new leadership, becoming a model for diversity and fairness in the luxury market. And Shaq? He never gloated, never rubbed it in. He had done what he always did, handled business the right way, no violence, no shouting, just action. The sun was just beginning to set over Atlanta, casting a golden glow over the city. It had been weeks since Hamilton Luxury Motors had officially changed ownership, and yet, the impact of what had happened still rippled through the business world. Shaquille O'Neal had made one final move, one that no one had seen coming. Instead of keeping the dealership as part of his business empire, he donated it. The press conference was held outside the newly rebranded Hamilton Auto and Equity Center, where the dealership's sign had been taken down and replaced with one that symbolized a new beginning. Reporters, business leaders, and community members gathered as Shaq stood on stage, towering over the podium, his mother Lucille beside him, her presence as regal as ever. From day one, this was never about a car, Shaq began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. This was about respect, about making sure people like my mom, people like all of us, are treated the way they deserve to be. There was a pause, the weight of his words sinking in. So today, I'm making it official. I'm not keeping this dealership. Instead, I'm donating it to a Black-owned business initiative that will create real opportunities in luxury car sales. A wave of cheers erupted, people rising to their feet, clapping and shouting in support. Shaq smiled, holding up a hand to settle the crowd. This isn't just a business anymore. It's a place where everyone gets treated with the same level of dignity, whether they walk in wearing a three-piece suit or jeans and sneakers. Avery Carter, now the official director of operations, stepped forward and shook Shaq's hand before turning to the audience. For too long, places like this have been built on exclusivity, on shutting people out. But not anymore. This place will stand for inclusion, representation, and fairness. And I promise you, we're just getting started. While the transformation of Hamilton Motors was making headlines, another battle had been won behind the scenes, one that was deeply personal to Avery. After years of silence, her father, James Carter, had finally seen justice. The wrongful termination case that had been reopened after the dealership scandal had ended in his favor. The financial firm that had pushed him out all those years ago was now being held legally accountable, forced to issue a public apology and pay a massive settlement. For James, it wasn't just about the money. It was about clearing his name. Standing on the front porch of their home, Avery handed him the official court ruling. "It's over, Dad," she said softly. They finally admitted it. James took the paper, staring at it for a long moment before exhaling deeply. He had spent years carrying the weight of injustice, wondering if speaking up had been the right thing to do. But now, looking at his daughter, strong, confident, fearless, he knew it had all been worth it. "I'm proud of you, Avery," he said, emotion thick in his voice. Avery smiled. "I learned from the best." Days later, Lucille O'Neal stepped out of her house, the keys to her brand new black Rolls-Royce Phantom in hand. The car gleamed under the afternoon sun, a symbol of everything she had overcome, not just in that dealership, but in life. She slid into the driver's seat, running her hands over the smooth leather steering wheel. It was more than just a luxury vehicle. It was proof that no one could define her worth but herself. As she pulled out of the driveway, she took the long route through the city. through the same streets where people once doubted her. The grocery store where she had counted every penny, making sure she had enough to feed her kids. The old diner where she had once worked double shifts, her hands sore from cleaning tables all night. The bus stop where she had waited, holding Shaq's little hand, dreaming of a better life for him. And now she wasn't waiting anymore. Now she was driving. People on the sidewalks turned as the sleek car rolled by. A few recognized her and waved. She waved back. She wasn't a woman who needed validation. She never had. But today, she allowed herself to enjoy it. Later that evening, Shaq was sitting on the back patio of his home when Lucille joined him, her movements slow and deliberate. She sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, looking out at the sunset. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Shaq, ever playful, smirked. "So, how's the ride?" Lucille let out a soft laugh. "It's nice," she admitted. "But you know I didn't need it." Shaq turned to her, his expression softer now. "I know." Lucille studied her son, her heart swelling with pride. "You always were a big-hearted boy," she murmured, "always looking out for people, even when you didn't have much yourself." Shaq shrugged. "I learned from you." She smiled, reaching over to pat his knee. "I ever tell you how proud I am of you?" Shaq smirked. "Only 1,000 times." Lucille chuckled. "Well, here's 1,001. She turned to him, her expression full of love and wisdom. "You know, people think strength is about power, about being bigger, louder, tougher. But real strength? It's about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground." Shaq nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Then, after a moment, he looked at her with that signature grin of his. "You've always been a queen, Ma." He gestured toward the city. "Now the world knows it too." Lucille blinked, emotion filling her eyes. But she didn't cry. She just squeezed his hand and nodded. "Damn right they do." The story of Lucille O'Neal, Shaquille O'Neal, and Avery Carter had become more than just a scandal. It had become a symbol of justice, change, and the power of standing up for what's right. Hamilton Motors thrived under its new leadership, becoming a model for diversity in luxury spaces. Other dealerships and high-end businesses reevaluated their own policies, some even reaching out to Shaq for guidance. Avery continued her legal journey, using her new position to push for systemic changes in business ethics and consumer rights. And Lucille? She kept driving, through the same city where she had once struggled, now with the windows down, the wind in her hair, and the world finally seeing her for who she had always been, unstoppable. The legacy of this story wasn't just about one dealership, one incident, or one fight. It was about dignity, respect, and the reminder that sometimes the best revenge is success. Injustice thrives in silence, but change happens when we speak up. This story isn't just about Lucille O'Neal or Shaquille O'Neal. It's about everyone who has ever been judged, dismissed, or told they don't belong. If you believe in fairness, dignity, and real change in high-end spaces, don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Support businesses that stand for inclusion, call out discrimination when you see it, and demand better. Share this story, start the conversation, and let's make sure respect isn't a luxury. It's the standard.